Chapter 1. The Quill That Told Truth. Rita Skeeter had always believed that truth was a luxury the wizarding public couldn't afford. Too stark, too uncomfortable, too likely to interfere with a perfectly good story. She preferred her own version of events. More colourful, more dramatic, infinitely more sellable. But as she crouched in beetle form beneath the sticky table at the Three Broomsticks this Valentine's evening, watching condensation drip from abandoned butterbeers onto the sawdust floor, she had no idea that her quick quotes quill was about to betray 30 years of profitable fabrication. The Three Broomsticks hummed with its usual evening energy. Couples occupied corner booths, their whispered conversations mixing with the clink of glasses and Madame Rosmerta's cheerful calls to the barmaids. Rita had chosen her position carefully, close enough to the private alcove near the back staircase to overhear conversations, far enough from the main traffic to avoid being accidentally stepped on. February 14th provided excellent cover for clandestine meetings. Everyone was too focused on their own romantic entanglements to notice an old man slipping through the back entrance. Albus Dumbledore entered precisely at 9 o'clock, his usual theatrical robes replaced with something considerably more subdued. Rita's beetle eyes tracked his movement as he settled into the shadowed alcove, his back to the wall in a way that suggested this was not a casual social call. The headmaster's fingers drummed against the scarred wooden table, and for the first time in Rita's memory, Dumbledore looked genuinely troubled. She had been following whispers about secret meetings for weeks, ever since her interview with Harry Potter had revealed more questions than answers about the boy's strange entry into the Tri-Wizard tournament. Something was stirring beneath the surface of the wizarding world's carefully maintained peace, and Rita could smell a story like a bloodhound scenting prey. The door opened again, bringing a rush of cold February air and the unmistakable silhouette of Severus Snape. Rita's antennae quivered with anticipation. The potions master moved through the pub like a shadow, his black cloak billowing behind him as he navigated between tables without so much as glancing at their occupants. When he reached Dumbledore's alcove, he sat without preamble, his pale hands folded on the table. "You're certain he suspects nothing?" Dumbledore's voice was lower than his usual grandfatherly tone, tinged with an urgency Rita had never heard before. Snape's response was barely above a whisper. "The Dark Lord grows more paranoid each day, but my position remains secure. The information you provided about the Potter boy's protection has convinced him of my continued loyalty." Rita felt a thrill of excitement course through her tiny body. This was it, the story that would cement her reputation forever. She began the mental transformation back to human form, her reporter's bag already containing her quick quotes, quill and parchment. But as her beetle shell dissolved and her human senses returned, something felt different about the familiar weight of the quill in her hand. "The boy must be prepared," Dumbledore continued, seemingly oblivious to Rita's transformation in the shadows. "When Voldemort returns, and he will return, Harry must be ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. Your role in maintaining that readiness cannot be overstated." Rita's breath caught in her throat. Voldemort's return! The name alone sent ice through her veins, but the implications of Dumbledore's words were even more chilling. She positioned her quill above the parchment, expecting the familiar surge of creative interpretation that usually accompanied her note-taking. Instead, the quill began writing with mechanical precision, recording each word exactly as spoken. "The necessary sacrifices have already been made," Snape replied, his voice carrying a weight that made Rita shiver. "The Dursley placement, the isolation, the careful cultivation of his martyr complex. He will choose death willingly when the time comes, believing it serves the greater good." Rita stared at her parchment in shock. The words appearing on the page were not her usual embellished paraphrases, but direct quotations, verbatim recordings of one of the most explosive conversations in wizarding history. Her quill, which had spent decades transforming mundane interviews into scandalous exposés, was suddenly functioning like some kind of magical recording device. "And if he chooses otherwise?" Dumbledore asked. "Then we will ensure he has no choice at all." Snape's response was delivered with such cold certainty that Rita's hand trembled, causing her quill to skip across the parchment. "The prophecy must be fulfilled, Headmaster, one way or another." The two men sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their conversation settling over the alcove like a shroud. Rita forced herself to remain perfectly still, afraid that even breathing might alert them to her presence. Around them, the three Broomsticks continued its oblivious celebration of Valentine's Day, couples sharing toasts and laughter, while just feet away, two of the wizarding world's most respected figures discussed what sounded unmistakably like the planned sacrifice of a 14-year-old boy. "The Order need not know the full extent of our preparations," Dumbledore said finally. "They believe Harry's survival depends on love and protection. They need not learn that his death is equally essential. And Potter himself? Harry must never suspect until the moment arrives. His sacrifice will be meaningful only if he chooses it freely, believing himself to be saving others rather than fulfilling our design." Rita's quill moved relentlessly across the parchment, capturing every damning word. She had stumbled upon the story of the century, evidence that Albus Dumbledore, the supposed champion of light and hope, was systematically preparing Harry Potter for death while deceiving everyone who trusted him. The implications were staggering, the moral questions endless, and the potential impact on public opinion devastating. Snape leaned forward, his dark eyes reflecting the candlelight from the nearby tables. "The Dark Lord expects regular reports on the boy's progress. What shall I tell him? The truth, in carefully measured doses. Harry grows stronger, but remains isolated. His friends provide support, but he still bears his burdens alone. Voldemort will appreciate the irony, that our methods of protection serve equally well as preparation for sacrifice. And if the Order begins to suspect?" Dumbledore's smile was sad but resolute. "Then we remind them that war requires difficult choices. Some will understand. Others—" He shrugged, the gesture somehow more chilling than any threat. "Others will do what they believe is right, as they always have." The conversation continued for another quarter hour, covering details about Harry's training, his emotional state, and the careful manipulation of his circumstances to ensure maximum psychological impact when the time came for his final choice. Rita recorded it all, her quick quotes quill functioning with unprecedented accuracy as it documented what amounted to a confession of profound mistreatment disguised as noble sacrifice. When the two men finally rose to leave, Rita remained frozen in her hiding spot, afraid to move until their footsteps had completely faded. Only then did she dare to examine what her quill had written, reading through page after page of direct quotations that would revolutionize the wizarding world's understanding of their most trusted leader. For 30 years, Rita Skeeter had built her career on distorting truth to serve sensation. She had twisted innocent comments into scandalous implications, transformed minor disagreements into epic feuds, and manufactured controversies from thin air. But tonight, for the first time in her professional life, she held in her hands a story that needed no embellishment whatsoever. The truth, it seemed, was far more shocking than any lie she could have invented. Rita gathered her materials with shaking hands, her mind already racing through the implications of what she had witnessed. This story would end careers, destroy reputations, and potentially save the life of a boy who had been marked for death by the very people sworn to protect him. For once in her life, Rita Skeeter was going to print exactly what she had heard, word for word, without modification or interpretation. The wizarding world was about to learn that their greatest hero might be their greatest villain, and that sometimes the most dangerous lies were the ones told in the name of love. As she stepped out into the cold February night, Rita felt the weight of genuine journalism settling on her shoulders for the first time in decades. Tomorrow's Daily Prophet would change everything, and for once, every word would be absolutely, irrefutably true. The Quill had told truth, and truth, she was about to discover, was the most powerful magic of all. Chapter 2. Headlines that Shatter Worlds. The Daily Prophet's morning edition landed on the Hogwarts breakfast tables with all the subtlety of a dragon's roar. Harry Potter was reaching for his usual piece of toast when the headline caught his eye, and the words hit him like a physical blow. Dumbledore's Death Eater. Deal. Verbatim transcript reveals secret alliance. By Rita Skeeter, special correspondent. What followed was unlike anything Rita Skeeter had ever written. Gone were her usual flowery adjectives and dramatic interpretations. In their place sat stark, unadorned quotations that read like evidence from a criminal trial. Harry's hands shook as he read the opening paragraph. On the evening of February 14th, this reporter witnessed a clandestine meeting between Albus Dumbledore and known Death Eater Severus Snape at the Three Broomsticks. What follows is a verbatim transcript of their conversation, recorded by magical means and verified for accuracy. The Great Hall's morning chatter began to falter as more students unfolded their papers. Harry could hear sharp intakes of breath from the Ravenclaw table, followed by whispered consultations over shared newspapers. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy's face had gone pale as parchment. Harry's eyes found the first direct quotation, and his world tilted sideways. "The boy must be prepared," Dumbledore stated. "When Voldemort returns, and he will return, Harry must be ready to make the ultimate sacrifice." The words swam before Harry's eyes. He blinked hard, certain he had misread, but the text remained unchanged. His name, printed in the Daily Prophet alongside talk of sacrifice and Voldemort's return. The toast turned to ash in his mouth. "Harry?" Hermione's voice sounded distant, though she was sitting directly across from him. "Harry, what's wrong? You've gone completely white." He couldn't answer. His eyes were already racing to the next quotation, each one more damning than the last. "The necessary sacrifices have already been made," Snape replied. The Dursley placement, the isolation, the careful cultivation of his martyr complex. He will choose death willingly when the time comes, believing it serves the greater good. Harry's chair scraped against the stone floor as he pushed back from the table. Several nearby conversations stopped entirely. Hermione leaned forward, concern etched across her features, while Ron dropped his fork with a clatter that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet hall. "Let me see that," Hermione demanded, reaching for the paper. Harry handed it over, wordlessly, watching as her analytical mind processed what he had just read. Her expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something approaching horror as she read deeper into the article. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Rita Skeeter doesn't write like this. She embellishes everything, makes up quotes, adds dramatic flourishes. This reads like a court transcript," Ron finished grimly, reading over her shoulder. His freckles stood out starkly against his pale skin. "Fierce hell, Harry. Listen to this bit. And if he chooses otherwise," Dumbledore asked, "then we will ensure he has no choice at all," Snape responded. The words carried across the hall with devastating clarity. Every conversation within earshot ground to a halt. Students began turning in their seats, staring at Harry with expressions ranging from pity to fear to morbid curiosity. The weight of their collective gaze pressed down on him like a physical force. At the high table, Professor McGonagall had gone rigid in her chair, her own copy of the Prophet clutched in white-knuckled hands. Her lips moved soundlessly as she read, and Harry caught the moment when she reached the most damning passages, Her face drained of all colour, and she looked directly at him with something that might have been anguish. "Where's Dumbledore?" Neville Longbottom's voice carried from the Gryffindor table, louder than he probably intended. Indeed, the headmaster's ornate chair sat conspicuously empty, its golden upholstery seeming to mock the accusations spread across every newspaper in the hall. McGonagall rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Mr. Potter," she called across the hall, her voice carefully controlled but audibly strained. "Please come with me. Mr. Weasley, Miss Granger, you as well." As they moved toward the staff table, Harry became aware of the sound building around them. Not the usual breakfast chatter, but something else entirely. Whispers, yes, but also the rustle of parchment as students passed sections of the article back and forth, the scratch of quills as some began writing what could only be letters home, and underneath it all, a growing undercurrent of unease that seemed to permeate the very air. "Professor," Harry began as they reached McGonagall, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Not here," she said tersely, her Scottish accent more pronounced than usual. "My office. Now." But before they could leave the Great Hall, the morning owl post arrived with unprecedented volume. The usual dozen or so owls became a veritable storm of wings and feathers as what appeared to be hundreds of birds descended upon the tables. Letters, howlers, and rolled newspapers rained down like a judgment from above. Harry watched in fascination and growing dread as owl after owl landed before students throughout the hall. The Weasley twins received what looked like an urgent letter from their mother. Harry could tell by the way their faces went from curiosity to alarm in the span of seconds. Neville's grandmother's familiar eagle owl dropped a red envelope that began smoking ominously before Neville had even touched it. At the Slytherin table, Pansy Parkinson was reading what appeared to be a frantic note from her parents, her usual smug expression replaced by genuine fear. Even Crabbe and Goyle seemed to understand that something momentous was happening, though their confused expressions suggested they were still working through the article's implications. The sound of the howler activating from the Ravenclaw table made everyone flinch. "How dare you remain in that school when that man is planning violence?" shrieked a woman's voice that Harry didn't recognize. "Pack your things immediately. Your father is coming to collect you today." More howlers began activating in sequence, creating a cacophony of parental outrage, fear, and demands for immediate explanations. McGonagall's jaw tightened with each new outburst. "Silence!" she commanded, her voice magically amplified to carry over the chaos. The effect was immediate. Every howler fell quiet, every whispered conversation stopped, every rustling paper went still. In the sudden hush, her next words fell like stones into still water. "All copies of this morning's Daily Prophet are to be surrendered immediately. Anyone found spreading rumors based on unsubstantiated claims will face detention with Professor Snape." But even as she spoke, Harry could see the futility of the order. Too many students had already read too much. The damage was done, spreading like ripples across the surface of a disturbed pond. You couldn't unsay words that had already been spoken, couldn't unrid revelations that had already shattered comfortable assumptions. Hermione, still clutching her copy of the Prophet, looked between Harry and McGonagall with something approaching desperation. "Professor, surely you don't believe— this is Rita Skeeter. She's lied before, manipulated quotes, created stories out of nothing. There has to be an explanation." McGonagall's response was careful, measured, but telling in its very restraint. "Miss Granger, I have known Rita Skeeter for many years. I am familiar with her creative approach to journalism. This article—" She paused, seemingly weighing her words with extraordinary care. "This article does not read like her usual work." The admission hit Harry like a curse to the chest. If even McGonagall, loyal, steadfast McGonagall, couldn't dismiss the story outright, what hope did any of them have? Around the hall, students continued reading, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotion that ranged from shock to betrayal to something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Not fear of Voldemort or Death Eaters, but fear of the man they had trusted most in the world. "The quote about the prophecy," Ron said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mate, you never told us about any prophecy." Harry's stomach dropped. He had no answer, because until this moment, he had known nothing about any prophecy either. But according to Rita's transcript, both Dumbledore and Snape had discussed it as established fact, something that must be fulfilled, no matter what choices Harry might make. As they finally left the Great Hall, Harry could hear the conversations resuming behind them, no longer whispered, but openly discussed with the kind of morbid fascination that accompanies any great scandal. Students who had never spoken to him before would now have opinions about his fate, theories about his purpose, speculation about his inevitable death. The worst part, Harry realized as they climbed the stairs toward McGonagall's office, was not the betrayal itself, but the horrible certainty settling in his chest that every quoted word might be absolutely, unforgivably true. By the time they reached the Transfiguration office, the morning owl post was still arriving in unprecedented waves, and the sound of howlers continued to echo through the castle like the cries of dying birds. The wizarding world was awakening to a new reality, and Harry Potter stood at its center, no longer the boy who lived, but the boy who was meant to die. The headlines had indeed shattered worlds, and the pieces would never quite fit back together again. Chapter 3. Questions Without Answers. Harry's feet carried him through the castle corridors with a fury he had never felt before. The morning's revelations churned in his stomach like poison, each quoted word from Rita's article echoing in his mind with devastating clarity. Students pressed themselves against the walls as he passed, their whispered conversations dying on their lips when they saw his face. The gargoyle that guarded Dumbledore's office seemed to leer at him as he approached. Harry realized he didn't know the password, but before he could even speak, the stone creature stepped aside with what sounded uncomfortably like a chuckle. "The headmaster is expecting you," it said in its gravelly voice. The circular staircase carried him upward, but instead of its usual magical wonder, the moving steps felt like a countdown to judgment. Harry's hands were shaking by the time he reached the oak door, though whether from rage or fear, he couldn't say. He didn't knock. Albus Dumbledore sat behind his desk, as though nothing had happened, as though the wizarding world hadn't been turned upside down by a newspaper article that morning. His hands were folded calmly atop a stack of parchment, and his blue eyes regarded Harry with the same gentle twinkle that had always made him feel safe and protected. Now it made him feel sick. "Harry," Dumbledore said softly, "I wondered when you might visit me today." "Is it true?" The words burst from Harry's lips before he could form a more coherent question. "The things Rita Skeeter wrote, the conversation she claimed to overhear, is any of it true?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently against the parchment. Around the office, his various silver instruments whirred and clicked with their usual mysterious purposes, but their familiar sounds now seemed ominous rather than comforting. "Truth," Dumbledore said finally, "is a curious thing, Harry. It can be shaped and molded, presented from different angles, interpreted through various lenses. What may appear to be truth from one perspective may be something else entirely from another." Harry felt his temper flare. "That's not an answer. I'm not asking for philosophy. I'm asking if you and Professor Snape discussed my death. I'm asking if you've been planning to sacrifice me since I was a baby." "Sometimes, Harry," Dumbledore continued in that same maddeningly calm tone, "the truth is more complex than it appears. The conversation Miss Skeeter claims to have witnessed, even if we accept her account as accurate, lacks the context that would make its meaning clear." "Then give me the context." Harry's voice cracked with frustration. "Stop talking in riddles and tell me what's happening to my life." Dumbledore's expression remained serene. but something flickered behind his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or calculation. There are things you are not yet ready to understand, Harry. Burdens that— "I'm not ready!" Harry's voice rose to a shout. "According to your conversation with Snape, I'm supposed to be ready to die. How much more ready can I possibly need to be?" For the first time since Harry had entered the office, Dumbledore's composure seemed to crack slightly. His fingers stilled their drumming, and he leaned back in his chair with something that might have been a sigh. "Harry, you must understand that every decision I have made regarding your welfare—" The office door opened with a soft click, and Severus Snape stepped inside. Harry spun around, and for a moment the two of them simply stared at each other. Snape's dark eyes were unreadable, but Harry thought he detected something new in their depths, not the usual contempt or irritation, but something that looked almost like guilt. "Headmaster," Snape said quietly, his gaze never leaving Harry's face, "I see you are occupied." "Professor Snape," Harry said, his voice deadly quiet. "Perfect timing. Perhaps you'd like to explain to me exactly what you meant when you told Professor Dumbledore that I would choose death willingly. When the time comes?" Snape's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Potter, you are in no position to demand explanations from—" "I'm in exactly the position to demand explanations," Harry interrupted. "It's my death you were discussing. My life you've apparently been manipulating since I was 1 year old." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the silver instruments seemed to have gone quiet, as though the office itself was holding its breath. Snape looked between Harry and Dumbledore, and for the first time in Harry's memory, the potions master appeared uncertain. "Professor Snape," Dumbledore said gently, "perhaps it would be best if we continued this conversation at another time." Snape's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of course, Headmaster. Another time, when the boy is not present to hear uncomfortable truths about his purpose." The word hit Harry like a physical blow. Purpose. As though his entire existence had been planned and orchestrated for a single, fatal moment. "Get out," Harry whispered. Snape raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon." "I said get out!" Harry's voice echoed off the stone walls. "Both of you have been lying to me for years, planning my death behind my back, and you have the nerve to act like I'm the one being unreasonable. Get out!" "Harry," Dumbledore said, rising from his chair with the slow, deliberate movements of a much older man. "You are overwrought. Perhaps it would be best if you returned to your dormitory and—" "Don't." Harry's voice was dangerously quiet. "Don't you dare tell me I'm overwrought. Don't you dare dismiss me like a child having a tantrum when you've been planning to feed me to Voldemort since before I could walk." Dumbledore's face went very still. "I think, Harry, that you have said quite enough for one day. Professor Snape and I have important matters to discuss. More important than the student whose death you're orchestrating? Return to your dormitory, Mr. Potter." Dumbledore's voice carried a note of authority that Harry had never heard directed at him before. "We will continue this conversation when you are capable of rational discourse." Harry stared at the man he had trusted above all others, searching those blue eyes for any sign of the grandfather figure who had guided him through his darkest moments. Instead, he found only cold calculation and a kind of impatient disappointment, as though Harry's emotional response was an inconvenience rather than a natural reaction to betrayal. "You're not going to deny it," Harry said slowly, the realization hitting him like ice water. "Everything Rita Skeeter wrote, you're not even going to try to deny it." Dumbledore's silence was answer enough. Harry turned and walked toward the door, his movements stiff and controlled. As his hand reached for the handle, Dumbledore spoke one last time. "Harry, I hope that someday you will understand that everything I have done has been motivated by love." Harry paused without turning around. "Whose love, Professor?" because it certainly wasn't love for me. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. Harry found Ron and Hermione in the Gryffindor common room, surrounded by the remnants of what appeared to be a heated argument with several other students. Dean and Seamus were shaking their heads emphatically, while Neville sat in a corner chair, looking pale and uncertain. "Harry!" Hermione jumped up as soon as she saw him. "What did Dumbledore say? Was he able to explain?" "He didn't explain anything," Harry said flatly, sinking into a chair beside the fire. "He spoke in riddles, told me the truth was complex, and basically confirmed that everything in Rita's article was accurate." Ron's face went white. "Fierce hell! So it's true. He really was planning to, kill me?" "Yes. Apparently that's been the plan all along." Hermione was shaking her head frantically. "That can't be right. There has to be some other explanation. Maybe the context was different. Maybe Rita misunderstood." "Hermione!" Harry's voice was tired, defeated. Dumbledore had the chance to deny it. He had the chance to explain it away, to provide that context you're talking about. Instead, he told me I wasn't ready to understand and dismissed me from his office like a disobedient child. The common room fell silent. Even the usual chatter from the younger students had stopped, and Harry became aware that everyone was listening to their conversation with rapt attention. "So what do we do now?" Ron asked quietly. Before Harry could answer, the portrait hole swung open, and Percy Weasley stepped through, looking harried and official in his ministry robes. His eyes immediately found Harry, and his expression was grim. "Potter," he said formally, "I'm here on behalf of the ministry. There are some questions about your welfare and living arrangements that need to be addressed immediately." Behind Percy, Harry could see more figures climbing through the portrait hole. Adults he didn't recognize, all wearing the formal robes of ministry officials. The investigation, it seemed, had already begun. As Percy approached with his clipboard and official documents, Harry found himself thinking about Dumbledore's final words. Everything motivated by love, he had said, but Harry was beginning to understand that there were different kinds of love. The kind that protected and cherished, and the kind that sacrificed for the greater good. He was finally learning the difference, and it was the most devastating lesson of his life. Outside the Gryffindor Tower windows, the February afternoon was growing dark, and with it, Harry's certainty that anyone in the world could be trusted to tell him the truth about his own life. The questions had been asked, but the answers, real answers, remained as elusive as ever. And in that silence, in that absence of truth, something fundamental had broken between Harry Potter and the man who had shaped his destiny from the shadows. Some fractures, Harry was beginning to realize, could never be repaired. Chapter 4. Ministry Intervention. The Minister for Magic arrived at Hogwarts like a storm front, dark robes billowing as he strode through the castle gates, with a contingent of auras flanking him on either side. Cornelius Fudge's usually pompous demeanor had been replaced by something harder, more decisive than Harry had ever seen from the man. Behind him, Amelia Bones moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to investigating the worst crimes Wizarding Society could produce. Harry watched from the Astronomy Tower window as the official delegation approached the castle entrance. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in their movements, the way the aura's hands rested near their wands, as though they expected resistance. "They're treating this like a crime scene," Hermione whispered beside him, her voice tight with worry. "Like they're investigating actual Death Eater activity." Ron pressed against the window on Harry's other side, his breath fogging the glass. "Maybe they are. I mean, if what Rita wrote is true, then Dumbledore has been planning my violence for 14 years, Harry finished flatly. The words had lost their power to shock him. After yesterday's confrontation in the headmaster's office, he had moved beyond disbelief into a kind of numb acceptance. They watched as the ministry officials disappeared into the castle, their purposeful stride suggesting this was no courtesy visit. Within minutes, the castle's atmosphere had shifted. House elves scurried through corridors with unusual haste, professors gathered in small, whispering groups, and students who had been attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy now openly stared and pointed whenever an aura passed by. By the time Harry and his friends reached the Great Hall for lunch, the transformation was complete. Where Dumbledore's ornate chair usually presided over the high table, Cornelius Fudge now sat in animated discussion with McGonagall. The deputy headmistress's face was drawn tight with stress, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Amelia Bones stood near the staff table's end, consulting a thick file while occasionally glancing up at the assembled students. Her presence radiated authority in a way that made even the older students unconsciously straighten their postures. "Where's Professor Dumbledore?" Ginny Weasley asked as she joined them at the Gryffindor table. "And where's Snape? His seat's been empty all morning." Harry felt his stomach drop. Snape's absence felt ominous in ways he couldn't fully articulate. If the potions master had fled rather than face ministry questioning, what did that say about his willingness to stand behind the conversation Rita had overheard? As if summoned by their questions, McGonagall rose from her seat and moved to the lectern usually reserved for Dumbledore's announcements. The hall fell silent with unprecedented speed. "Students," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, despite its obvious strain. "As you are aware, recent allegations have prompted an official ministry investigation into certain administrative decisions made by this school's leadership." A murmur rippled through the assembled students, but McGonagall continued without pause. "Professor Dumbledore has voluntarily submitted to questioning by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. During this period, I will be serving as acting headmistress. All classes will continue as scheduled, and normal school operations will remain in effect." Her words were carefully chosen, Harry noticed, but they couldn't hide the magnitude of what was happening. Dumbledore, the man who had defeated Grindelwald, who had led the resistance against Voldemort, who had seemed untouchable in his moral authority, was being questioned by auras like a common criminal. "What about Professor Snape?" called out a seventh-year Hufflepuff. "Where is he?" McGonagall's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Professor Snape has been granted a temporary leave of absence while certain matters are clarified." The translation was obvious to anyone who had read Rita's article. Snape had run rather than face questions about his alleged collaboration with Dumbledore's plans. As students began whispering frantically among themselves, Harry noticed Amelia Bones approaching their table. The head of magical law enforcement moved with deliberate purpose, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his scar prickle uncomfortably. "Mr. Potter," she said when she reached them, her voice carrying the formal tone of official business. "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately. There are some questions about your living arrangements that require clarification." Harry's friends exchanged worried glances, but Bones was already gesturing toward a smaller chamber off the Great Hall. Harry had little choice but to follow, though every instinct screamed that this conversation would not end well. The chamber Bones led him to was typically used for private conferences between staff and visiting dignitaries. Now it felt like an interrogation room, with two chairs facing each other across a small table where Bones had spread several official-looking documents. "Sit, please," she said, settling into her own chair with the practiced efficiency of someone who conducted such interviews regularly. "I want you to understand, Mr. Potter, that you are not under investigation. However, the allegations published by Ms. Skeeter have raised serious concerns about your welfare and the circumstances of your placement with your Muggle relatives." Harry remained silent, uncertain where this was leading. "According to ministry records," Bones continued, consulting one of her documents, "you were placed with your aunt and uncle following your parents' death based on a recommendation from Albus Dumbledore. The documentation indicates this placement was essential for your magical protection." She looked up at him directly. "What I find curious, Mr. Potter, is that there appears to be no formal ministry oversight of your living conditions. No regular welfare checks, no assessment of your guardian's suitability, no verification that the alleged protective measures were actually in place." Harry's mouth went dry. He thought of Privet Drive, of locked cupboards and barred windows, of years spent believing his parents had died in a car crash while his magical world remained hidden from him. "In fact," Bones continued, her tone growing harder, "when we attempted to verify the protective enchantments Professor Dumbledore claimed were essential to your safety, we discovered something rather troubling." She slid a parchment across the table toward him. The document was covered in official seals and complex magical formulas that Harry couldn't interpret, but the conclusion at the bottom was written in plain English. "No trace of advanced protective enchantments detected at specified address." "No enchantments," Harry said slowly, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. "You mean they just left me there, with no protection at all?" "It appears so, which raises significant questions about the true purpose of your placement." Bones leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but determined. "Mr. Potter, I need you to think carefully about your childhood with your relatives. Were there any signs that your treatment was deliberately harsh? Any indication that you were being prepared for hardship rather than protected from it?" The memories came flooding back. Years of hunger, isolation, verbal abuse, the careful cultivation of his belief that he was unwanted, unloved, a burden to be endured rather than a child to be cherished. The Dursleys' treatment of him had always seemed like simple cruelty, but now Bones was suggesting it might have been something more calculated. "The conversation Ms. Skeeter overheard," Harry said quietly, "mentioned the Dursley placement specifically. Snape said something about careful cultivation of his martyr complex." Bones nodded grimly. "We're beginning to suspect that your placement was never about protection, Mr. Potter. It may have been about psychological conditioning, ensuring that when the time came, you would be willing to sacrifice yourself without question." The room seemed to spin around Harry. Everything he had believed about his childhood, about Dumbledore's care for his welfare, about the love that was supposed to protect him, all of it crumbling like a house built on sand. "There's more," Bones continued, her voice growing softer. "We've been investigating Professor Dumbledore's handling of several other cases over the years. Students who died in what appeared to be noble sacrifices, families who suffered losses that might have been prevented with different choices. There's a pattern, Mr. Potter, of individuals being placed in situations where self-sacrifice becomes their only option." Harry thought of Cedric, of all the dangerous situations he had been guided into throughout his years at Hogwarts, of the way adults had consistently withheld crucial information while pushing him toward increasingly perilous choices. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we determine the full extent of what's been done to you, and we make sure it stops." Bones gathered her documents with practiced efficiency. "You'll be staying at Hogwarts for the remainder of the investigation, but arrangements are being made for alternative guardianship options. The Dursley placement will be terminated immediately." As they prepared to leave the chamber, Harry heard the sound of raised voices from the Great Hall. Through the doorway, he could see parents streaming into the castle, not the usual proud, excited parents visiting for a Quidditch match, but angry, frightened parents demanding answers about their children's safety. Mrs. Weasley stood near the entrance in heated discussion with McGonagall, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "How could none of us have known? How could we have trusted our children to this school when the headmaster was planning to violence students?" Other parents were making similar demands, some already leading their children toward the exits with hastily packed trunks. The exodus had begun, and with it, the collapse of everything Hogwarts represented. Near the staff table, Harry spotted Rita Skeeter interviewing what appeared to be a house elf, One of the anonymous sources for her follow-up articles, no doubt. Even from across the hall, her quill was moving with that same mechanical precision that had captured Dumbledore's damning words just days before. "Mr. Potter," Bones said quietly, following his gaze. "I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand that what's happening here isn't your fault. You're the victim in this situation, not the cause." Harry nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. As they returned to the chaos of the Great Hall, he couldn't shake the feeling that his very existence had somehow poisoned everything around him. The school was fracturing, trusted adults were revealed as manipulators, and families were fleeing in fear, all because Rita Skeeter had overheard a conversation about his planned death. The Ministry had intervened to save him, but Harry wondered if salvation was possible when the very foundation of his world had proven to be built on lies. Some institutions, like some trust, might be too broken to repair. As he watched parents collecting their children and professors whispering in corners, Harry realized that the investigation was just beginning. The truth, when it finally emerged, might prove even more devastating than the lies they had all lived with for so long. Chapter 5. The Black Family Gambit, Sirius. Black walked through the front gates of Hogwarts at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, making no attempt to hide his identity or conceal his presence. Students scattered like startled birds as he strode up the path in broad daylight, his long black hair whipping behind him in the February wind, his grey eyes blazing with a fury that made even seventh years step hastily out of his way. Harry was in the middle of a particularly tense defense against the dark arts lesson when the classroom door burst open. Professor Moody's magical eye swiveled toward the interruption, his hand reaching instinctively for his wand before freezing in apparent recognition. "Black," Moody growled, though his tone held more wariness than hostility. "Didn't expect to see you walking through the front door." "Where is he?" Sirius's voice cut through the classroom's stunned silence like a blade. His eyes swept the room until they found Harry, and the relief that crossed his features was almost painful to witness. "Harry, pack your things. We're leaving." The classroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Several students turned to stare at Harry, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear, excitement, and morbid curiosity. Draco Malfoy had gone pale as parchment, his grey eyes, so similar to Sirius's own, wide with something that looked like recognition. "Mr. Black," Moody said carefully, his magical eye now fixed on the doorway behind Sirius. "I think you might want to reconsider walking into a school full of ministry officials while you're still technically a wanted man." Sirius's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Technically wanted for crimes I didn't commit, while the man who actually orchestrated those crimes sits in this very castle planning the violence of my godson. I think my priorities are clear, Alastair." Harry found himself standing without consciously deciding to do so. "Sirius, what are you doing here? It's not safe. The Ministry is crawling all over the castle." "Good," Sirius said grimly. "Let them see me. Let them arrest me if they want to. But I'm not hiding anymore while Dumbledore treats you like a lamb marked for defeat." Before anyone could respond, the classroom door opened again, and this time the new arrival made even Sirius pause. Narcissa Malfoy swept into the room with the kind of cold elegance that could silence a room full of Death Eaters, her pale hair perfectly arranged despite the February wind, her dark robes impeccable. Draco's sharp intake of breath was audible across the classroom. "Mother, what are you doing here?" Narcissa's gaze moved from her son to Sirius, and something passed between the two Black family members that spoke of old blood ties and complicated histories. "Cousin," she said formally, inclining her head with the kind of respect that suggested this meeting was not entirely unexpected. The word hung in the air like a revelation. Students began whispering frantically. Narcissa Malfoy and Sirius Black were cousins, members of the same ancient pureblood family, and somehow they were here together in apparent alliance. "You received my letter," Sirius said, his tone losing some of its earlier hostility. I did. Narcissa's voice was carefully controlled, but Harry caught the undercurrent of something that might have been fear. And I agree that the situation has become untenable. The boy's protection cannot depend on the whims of men who see children as chess pieces. Moody's magical eye was spinning rapidly between the two black cousins. Well, this is an interesting development. Care to explain to the class what you two have been conspiring about? Not conspiring, Narcissa corrected coolly. Collaborating. There are more important things than old family feuds when children's lives are at stake. She turned to face Harry directly, her pale eyes studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Mr. Potter, I have been in correspondence with my cousin regarding your circumstances. What we have discovered about the so-called protections surrounding your placement is deeply troubling. From the back of the classroom, Draco's voice was barely above a whisper. Mother, you've been writing to him? To a blood traitor? The slap might as well have been physical. Narcissa's gaze snapped to her son, and for the first time since entering the room, her composure cracked slightly. Your father's prejudices have blinded you to many things, Draco. Sometimes blood matters more than politics. Sirius stepped forward, placing himself between the Malfoys in a gesture that seemed both protective and conciliatory. Narcissa has access to family records that I cannot reach while in hiding. The Black family tapestry, genealogical charts, ancient protection spells tied to bloodlines, information that's crucial to understanding how Harry's protection was supposed to work. Supposed to work? Harry asked, feeling that familiar sick sensation in his stomach. The blood protection Dumbledore claimed would keep you safe, Narcissa explained, her voice regaining its usual controlled precision, requires specific conditions to maintain its power. Willing sacrifice by a blood relative, continued residence with that relative's family, and most importantly, love and acceptance within that household. Sirius's hands clenched into fists. The Dursleys never loved you, Harry. They barely tolerated you. According to every magical law I can find, the protection should have failed within months of your placement. Harry felt the room spinning around him. But it didn't fail. I lived. I survived. You survived, Narcissa said quietly. But not because of love-based blood protection. The records suggest something else was keeping you alive. Something much darker and more binding. Before anyone could ask what she meant, the classroom door opened a third time, and Amelia Bones entered with 2 auras flanking her. Her eyes immediately found Sirius, and her hand moved to her wand in a gesture that was more reflexive than threatening. Sirius Black, she said formally. You're either very brave or very foolish to show yourself here. Director Bones, Sirius replied with a slight nod. I'm here to claim legal custody of my godson before any more harm can be done to him. You're a fugitive from justice. I'm innocent of the crimes I was accused of, as you very well know. Peter Pettigrew's confession cleared my name, even if the ministry was too proud to make it official. Bones considered this, her expression unreadable. Even if we accept your innocence, Mr. Black, you have no fixed address, no stable income, no way to provide for a child's needs. Narcissa stepped forward smoothly. He would not be alone in caring for the boy. The Black family has resources, properties, connections that could ensure Harry's safety while maintaining his education and social connections. You're offering to help? Bones asked, her surprise evident. I'm offering to do what's right, Narcissa replied. My own son is the same age as Harry Potter. If Dumbledore's methods extend to other students, if his willingness to sacrifice children for his vision of the greater good affects anyone else, then none of our children are safe. Draco was staring at his mother as though seeing her for the first time. You're really doing this. You're really allying with him. I'm protecting my family, Narcissa said firmly. All of my family. Blood is blood, Draco. whether you approve of their politics or not." Harry felt the weight of every eye in the room upon him. The choice Sirius was offering was real. Escape from Dumbledore's manipulations, protection from whatever plans were still in motion. Safety with family who were willing to fight for him rather than sacrifice him. But it would also mean leaving Hogwarts, leaving his friends, abandoning the life he had built here in favor of hiding behind black family protections that might not be any more reliable than Dumbledore's had been. "If I go with you," Harry said slowly, "what happens to everyone else? What happens to the other students if Dumbledore really is planning to use them too?" Sirius's expression softened. "Harry, you can't save everyone. You've been trying to save everyone since you were 11 years old, and look where it's gotten you, marked for death by the people who claimed to love you." "That's exactly why I can't just run away," Harry replied. "If I leave, if I let Sirius protect me while other students stay here, then I'm no better than Dumbledore. I'm just choosing which children get sacrificed for my safety." The room fell silent, except for the sound of wind rattling the windows. Even Narcissa seemed taken aback by his response, her pale eyes studying him with what might have been newfound respect. Bones spoke into the silence. "Mr. Potter, you're 14 years old. The decision of where you live and who protects you isn't solely yours to make. But the decision of who I trust is," Harry said firmly. "And right now, I don't know who I can trust with anyone's life, including my own." Sirius stepped closer, his voice dropping to the gentle tone Harry remembered from their brief time together the previous year. "Harry, I know you want to protect everyone. It's one of the things that makes you extraordinary. But you can't help anyone if you're dead. And I can't live with myself if I run away while other people suffer," Harry replied. "There has to be another way. Some middle ground where I can be safe but not abandon everyone else." Narcissa and Sirius exchanged a look that spoke of rapid mental calculations and family strategies refined over generations. "There might be," Narcissa said slowly. "A way to extend black family protection without removing you from Hogwarts entirely. But it would require formal adoption papers, blood magic rituals, and the cooperation of the Ministry. It would also," Sirius added grimly, "require us to trust that the Ministry won't use Harry as bait to draw me out of hiding permanently." Bones had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "If we were to consider such an arrangement, Mr. Black, it would come with conditions. Full cooperation with our investigation, testimony about what you know regarding Dumbledore's plans, and a formal review of your legal status." "Done," Sirius said immediately. "Anything to keep Harry safe and expose what Dumbledore has been doing." As the adults began discussing logistics and legal requirements, Harry found himself looking at Draco, who had remained silent throughout the latter part of the conversation. The Slytherin boy's expression was complicated. Confusion, anger, fear, and something that might have been envy, all warring across his features. "This is insane," Draco said finally. "All of it. My mother allying with blood traitors, the Ministry turning against Dumbledore, Potter having a choice about his own life for once. The whole world has gone mad." "Maybe," Harry said quietly. "Or maybe the world was always mad, and we're just finally seeing it clearly." Outside the classroom windows, the February afternoon was growing dark, and with it, Harry's certainty about anything at all. But for the first time since Rita's article had shattered his world, he felt like someone was fighting for him rather than planning his death. Whether that was enough to save him or anyone else remained to be seen. Chapter 6. Snape's Confession. Severus. Snape walked into the Ministry's makeshift interrogation chamber at Hogwarts, like a man approaching his own condemned. His hands were steady as he placed them flat on the scarred wooden table, but Harry could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control that suggested a man balancing on the edge of a precipice. "I wish to make a full confession," Snape said without preamble, his dark eyes meeting Amelia Bones's gaze directly. "Under veritaserum, if necessary. I will hide nothing." The chamber, formerly a small classroom near the dungeons, had been transformed into something that felt uncomfortably like a courtroom. Bones sat across from Snape with two auras flanking her, while a court recorder's quill scratched notes in the corner. Harry had been allowed to observe at Sirius's insistence, though he wasn't sure whether that was a kindness or a cruelty. "That's quite an offer, Professor Snape," Bones said carefully. "Are you certain you understand the implications? Under veritaserum, you'll be compelled to answer any question we ask, about any subject." "I understand perfectly." Snape's voice carried its usual disdain, but underneath Harry detected something else. Exhaustion, perhaps, or relief. "I am tired of secrets, Director Bones. Tired of living in the shadows while children suffer for adult machinations." Bones nodded to one of the auras who produced a small vial of clear liquid. 3 drops, she instructed, and Harry watched as Snape tilted his head back without hesitation, accepting the veritaserum as though it were a sacrament. The effect was almost immediate. Snape's rigid posture relaxed slightly, his usual sneer softening into something approaching neutrality. His eyes, when they refocused on Bones, held the glassy quality of absolute honesty. "State your full name for the record," Bones began. "Severus Tobias Snape. Your current occupation? Potions master at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, double agent for the Order of the Phoenix, Death Eater in the service of Tom Marvolo Riddle, also known as Lord Voldemort." The words hit the chamber like physical blows. Even though Harry had suspected something like this, hearing it confirmed under truth serum was different. Snape was a Death Eater, had always been a Death Eater, but he was also working against Voldemort. "Explain the Order of the Phoenix," Bones commanded. "A secret organization founded by Albus Dumbledore during the First War against Voldemort. Its members work to oppose the Death Eaters and protect those targeted by Voldemort's regime. I have been providing intelligence to the Order since late 1980. Why did you change sides?" Snape's face went very still, and when he spoke, his voice carried a pain that made Harry's chest tighten. "Lord Voldemort targeted Lily Evans Potter for death. I loved her. I begged Dumbledore to protect her and her family in exchange for my service as a spy." The chamber fell silent, except for the scratch of the recording quill. Harry felt as though the air had been sucked from his lungs. Snape had loved his mother, had betrayed Voldemort to save her. "The conversation overheard by Rita Skeeter on February 14th, Bones continued. "Explain the context." "Several Death Eaters have been making contact, testing my loyalty in preparation for the Dark Lord's eventual return. The conversation was about maintaining my cover, appearing to be a loyal Death Eater while actually working to protect Potter and gather intelligence." The phrase, "the boy must be prepared," Bones read from her notes. What did this refer to? Training Potter to survive Voldemort's return. Teaching him defensive magic, mental shields, strategic thinking. The Dark Lord will come for him eventually. He must be ready. Harry felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. The conversation hadn't been about planning his death. It had been about keeping him alive. But the relief was short-lived as Bones continued her questioning. The statement about necessary sacrifices, elaborate. "Other Order members who might need to die to maintain my cover. Dumbledore and I discussed which deaths I could witness without breaking character, which I might need to cause myself to prove my loyalty, which intelligence was worth the cost in lives." The casual way Snape spoke of calculated deaths made Harry's stomach turn. These weren't abstract strategies. They were decisions about real people, real lives that would be weighed and measured and potentially discarded. "You stated that Potter would choose death willingly," Bones pressed. "Explain this." "The boy has a tendency toward self-sacrifice that borders on pathological. Dumbledore believes that when the time comes, Potter will choose to face Voldemort directly, rather than allow others to suffer in his place. This tendency did not require cultivation. It is inherent in his character. Bones leaned forward. But you also mentioned ensuring he has no choice at all. Snape's expression darkened even under the Veritaseerum's influence. If Potter's heroic instincts failed, Dumbledore had contingency plans. Situations could be arranged where saving others would require Potter to expose himself to mortal danger. The boy could be maneuvered into the necessary position through emotional manipulation, such as threatening his friends, placing them in danger that only he could address, using his connection to others as leverage to force compliance with necessary strategies. Harry felt sick, not just because of what Snape was revealing, but because he recognized the truth in it. How many times had he rushed into danger because someone he cared about was threatened? How many of those threats had been genuine, and how many had been orchestrated? The placement with the Dursleys, Bones said. Was this discussed? Extensively. Snape's voice grew colder. Dumbledore required Potter to be emotionally isolated, to believe himself unloved and unwanted. A child who values his own life too highly cannot be trusted to sacrifice it for others. The Dursleys' treatment was not an unfortunate necessity. It was a deliberate strategy. The words hung in the air like a curse. Harry's hands were shaking now, and he gripped the arms of his chair to keep them steady. 10 years of deliberate emotional abuse, carefully orchestrated to make him expendable in his own mind. You participated in this strategy? Bones asked. I reinforced it. My treatment of Potter at Hogwarts was designed to maintain his sense of unworthiness while simultaneously pushing him toward greater competence. I made him strong enough to survive what was coming, while ensuring he never felt valuable enough to preserve himself. Harry couldn't listen anymore. He pushed back from his chair, the scraping sound loud in the silent chamber. You hated me because you loved my mother, and you tormented me because you wanted to save me. Snape's glassy eyes found his, and for once there was no sneer, no contempt. I did what I believed was necessary to keep you alive, Potter. That it also satisfied my personal grievances was convenient. The protection you mentioned, Bones interjected, bringing the conversation back to official business. The blood magic at the Dursleys' home, was it genuine? No. The simple word was devastating in its finality. There were monitoring charms, alerts if Potter was seriously injured or killed, but no protective enchantments. Dumbledore required Potter to suffer, not to die prematurely. Then how did he survive numerous attempts on his life? Luck, skill, friends willing to die for him, and my interventions when absolutely necessary. The blood protection was always a lie, designed to justify the placement. Bones looked down at her notes, her expression grim. Professor Snape, in your opinion, are Albus Dumbledore's methods morally justified? The Veritaserum compelled honesty, even about complex moral questions. Dumbledore's goal, preventing Voldemort's permanent victory, is just. His methods sacrifice individual welfare for collective benefit. They are effective, but not moral. Children should not be weapons, regardless of the nobility of the cause. And yet you participated. I participated because I believed it was the only way to honor Lily Potter's sacrifice and protect her son. I was wrong. There should have been other options. We should have found other options. The admission seemed to cost him something, even under truth serum. Harry realized that this confession wasn't just about clearing up the misunderstanding from Rita's article. It was about Snape acknowledging his own moral failure. Final question, Bones said. If you could do it again, knowing what you know now, would you make the same choices? Snape was quiet for a long moment, the Veritaserum compelling him to search for absolute truth rather than convenient answers. I would still work to protect Potter, but I would not sacrifice his childhood, his sense of worth, or his emotional well-being to do it. The end does not always justify the means, regardless of what Dumbledore believes. As the Veritaserum began to wear off, Snape's usual sharp awareness returned to his eyes. He looked directly at Harry, his expression unreadable but somehow different than it had ever been before. "I cannot ask your forgiveness, Potter," he said quietly. "What I did to you was inexcusable, regardless of my motivations. But I can ensure that such methods are never used again." Harry stared at the man who had tormented him for 4 years, trying to reconcile this admission with the sneering professor who had made his life miserable. The explanation didn't excuse the cruelty, but it provided context that made everything more complicated. "I don't understand," Harry said finally. "If you were trying to protect me, if you loved my mother, why did you make it so personal? Why did you have to enjoy hurting me?" Snape's smile was bitter. "Because you look like your father, Potter, and because hating you was easier than hating myself for what I was doing to you." The honesty was brutal and complete. Around the chamber, the adults absorbed this revelation in various states of discomfort and recognition. The story was more complex than Rita's article had suggested, but it wasn't more comforting. As they filed out of the interrogation chamber, Harry found himself walking beside Bones. "Director," he said quietly, "what happens now?" "Now we have to decide whether good intentions justify harmful methods," she replied grimly, "and whether the wizarding world is ready for that kind of moral complexity." Behind them, Snape remained seated at the scarred table, no longer a figure of simple hatred, but not yet someone Harry could forgive. The truth had been told, but truth, Harry was learning, was rarely as simple or as satisfying as he had hoped it would be. Some confessions, he realized, only made the questions more difficult to answer. Chapter 7. The Order Fractures. The kitchen at number 12. Grimmauld Place had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Harry sat at the scarred wooden table, surrounded by faces he recognized from photographs and whispered conversations, feeling as though he had stepped into a secret world that had been operating around him his entire life without his knowledge. Sirius sat protectively close to his left, while across the table, Molly Weasley's face was flushed with an anger Harry had never seen directed at anyone other than her own children. Remus Lupin looked haggard, his usually kind eyes shadowed with something that might have been guilt. Mad-Eye Moody's magical eye spun restlessly between the assembled members, while Kingsley Shacklebolt sat rigid in his aura robes, official documents spread before him like evidence in a trial. "Let me be perfectly clear," Molly said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "For 14 years, we have been complicit in the systematic abuse of a child. We have we have facilitated his isolation, his suffering, his manipulation, all in the name of protection." Dumbledore sat at the head of the table, his usually twinkling eyes dim with exhaustion. The past few days had aged him visibly, and for the first time since Harry had known him, the headmaster looked every one of his 113 years. "Molly," he said gently, "you must understand that every decision was made with Harry's ultimate welfare." "Don't!" Molly's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Don't you dare talk to me about Harry's welfare when you've spent his entire life preparing him for death. Don't you dare use that grandfatherly tone when you've been treating him like a weapon to be sharpened and wielded." Harry felt the weight of every eye in the room upon him. The Order of the Phoenix, a secret organization he had never known existed, made up of people who had apparently been watching him, protecting him, and planning around him for his entire life. The revelation was overwhelming in its scope and terrifying in its implications. "Mrs. Weasley is right," said a voice Harry didn't recognize. A young witch with violently purple hair raised her hand tentatively. "I'm Nymphadora Tonks, Aura, and I've been part of the surveillance detail. What we've been doing, it's not protection, it's monitoring. There's a difference." Remus leaned forward, his scarred hands clasped tightly on the table. "Molly, Tonks, I understand your concerns, but you have to remember what we were facing. Voldemort's return was always inevitable. Harry needed to be prepared." "Prepared, yes," Molly interrupted, "but not broken, not isolated, not conditioned to see himself as expendable." She turned to face Harry directly, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears. "Harry, dear, I need you to know that some of us never agreed with these methods. Some of us argued against them. But not hard enough," Sirius said grimly. "None of us argued hard enough. We all went along with Dumbledore's plans because we trusted him, and because it was easier than confronting the moral implications of what we were doing." Mad-Eye Moody's gruff voice cut through the tension. "Trust is a luxury in war, Black. We did what we had to do to keep the boy alive. The surveillance was necessary, watching from a distance, tracking threats, maintaining awareness of his condition." Harry felt his stomach drop. Surveillance? What kind of surveillance? Moody's magical eye fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "Continuous, Potter. Watchers in the neighborhood, scrying mirrors, tracking charms on your belongings, monitoring your health, your emotional state, your magical development." We knew everything. "Everything?" Harry's voice came out as a whisper. "When you were hungry, when you were hurt, when you cried yourself to sleep, when you practiced magic in secret," Moody continued remorselessly. "Every moment of every day for 14 years. Someone was watching." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Harry's ragged breathing. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow. Not just that he had been watched, but that his watchers had known about his suffering and done nothing to stop it. "You knew," he said, looking around the table at faces that had become suddenly difficult to meet. "All of you knew what they were doing to me, and you just watched." Remus's voice was barely audible. "Harry, you have to understand. You believed that watching a child be abused was acceptable as long as it served your purposes." Harry's voice was getting stronger, fueled by a fury he had never felt before. "You convinced yourselves that monitoring my suffering was the same as protecting me." Kingsley cleared his throat, his deep voice carrying the weight of official authority. "Mr. Potter, the Ministry's investigation has revealed the extent of the surveillance network. It goes beyond what even most Order members knew." He slid a thick file across the table. "Detailed logs, daily reports, psychological assessments, magical monitoring. You were studied like a laboratory specimen." Harry stared at the file without opening it, unwilling to read documentation of his own victimization. Who else knew? Who else was watching me suffer and calling it protection? "Not everyone," Tonks said quickly. "Some of us were just told to watch for external threats, not to monitor your home situation. We thought other people were handling that part." "And the people who were supposed to be handling it?" Harry asked. Dumbledore finally spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. "The responsibility was mine, Harry. The decisions were mine. If you must blame someone, I don't want to blame someone," Harry said, standing abruptly. "I want to understand how people who claim to care about me could watch me be starved and locked up and treated like a freak, and convince themselves it was for my own good." Molly rose as well, moving around the table toward him. "Harry, some of us didn't know. Some of us weren't told about the surveillance details. If I had known, if I had understood what was really happening." "You would have done what?" Harry asked. "Gone against Dumbledore? Broken ranks? Or would you have found a way to justify it like everyone else?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Around the table, Order members shifted uncomfortably, forced to confront their own complicity in decisions they had never questioned. "I can't speak for others," Remus said quietly. "But I can speak for myself. I failed you, Harry. I knew James and Lily. I loved them. And I allowed their son to be treated in ways they would never have accepted. I told myself it was necessary. But necessity doesn't make it right. "At least you're honest about it," Harry said. "But honesty doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the fact that I spent 10 years believing I was unloved and unwanted, while a room full of adults watched and took notes." Several Order members were shifting in their seats, some looking toward the door as though considering whether to stay for the rest of this confrontation. The unity that had held the organization together was fracturing before Harry's eyes. "Some of us can't be part of this anymore," said a wizard Harry didn't recognize. "Not if this is how we treat the people we're supposed to protect." He stood and moved toward the door. "I signed up to fight Death Eaters, not to abuse children in the name of the greater good." 2 more members followed him out, their footsteps echoing up the stairs. The Order was literally splitting apart in real time, and Harry felt responsible for the destruction even as he knew the fault lay elsewhere. "Let them go," Dumbledore said sadly. "Perhaps they're right. Perhaps we have lost sight of what we were meant to protect." "Perhaps?" Sirius's voice was incredulous. "Albus, we turned Harry's childhood into a strategic operation. We monitored his abuse instead of stopping it. We prepared him for death instead of teaching him to live." "There's no perhaps about it. We were wrong." Kingsley gathered his documents with careful precision. "The Ministry will need to determine which Order activities constitute legal surveillance and which cross the line into stalking and child endangerment. This investigation isn't over." As more members began to leave, some in anger, some in shame, some in simple confusion, Harry found himself looking at the remainder of the Order with new eyes. These weren't heroes or villains, just people who had made terrible decisions while convinced they were doing good. "What happens now?" he asked into the diminishing group. "Now we figure out how to protect you without destroying you," Molly said firmly. "How to keep you safe without treating you like property. How to include you in decisions about your own life instead of making them for you." "And if Voldemort returns while we're having this moral crisis?" asked the remaining Auror. "Then we face him with clean consciences instead of dirty hands," Sirius replied. "Harry's more likely to survive if he trusts the people protecting him than if he's fighting both sides." Harry looked around the depleted table at the faces of people who had controlled his life from the shadows for 14 years. Some were gone, unable to reconcile their principles with their actions. Some remained, committed to finding a better way. And some, like Dumbledore, sat in the ruins of their moral authority, trying to understand how good intentions had led to such devastating outcomes. The Order of the Phoenix had fractured tonight, but perhaps, Harry thought, something better could be built from the pieces, something that treated him as a person rather than a project, as someone to be protected rather than prepared for sacrifice. Whether it would be enough to save anyone remained to be seen. But at least now the lies were out in the open, and the real work could begin. Chapter 8. Student Uprising. The impromptu meeting in the Room of Requirement had started with just Harry, Hermione, and Ron, but word had spread through the castle with the speed that only teenage whispers could achieve. By the time darkness fell over Hogwarts, students from every house had gathered in the spacious chamber, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and fear that Harry had never seen before. "We can't just sit here waiting for adults to decide our fate," Hermione was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Every revelation of the past week has made it clear that the people in charge have been making decisions about our lives without consulting us, without even informing us of the dangers we face." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled students. Harry counted nearly 50 faces in the candlelit room: Gryffindors, Ravenclaws, Hufflepuffs, and even a surprising number of Slytherins, who had apparently decided that house loyalty mattered less than survival. "She's right," said a voice from the Slytherin contingent, and Harry was startled to see Draco Malfoy step forward. "My own mother has been secretly allying with blood traitors to protect students from a headmaster we all trusted. If the adults can't figure out who to trust, then maybe it's time we stopped trusting them to protect us." The statement sent a shock through the room. Draco Malfoy, pure-blood supremacist, Slytherin prince, Harry's longtime rival was advocating for student self-determination. The world had indeed turned upside down. "Easy for you to say, Malfoy," called out Dean Thomas. "Your family has money and connections. The rest of us just have whatever protection Hogwarts provides." Which, as recent events have shown, isn't much, Draco replied coolly. "Dumbledore has been planning to sacrifice students for the greater good, and none of our parents knew. Do you really think your Muggle family will be safer than my Death Eater one when Voldemort returns?" The casual mention of Voldemort's name sent several students flinching, but Harry noticed that most stood their ground. Fear was being replaced by something more powerful, anger at being treated like pawns in adult games. "He's got a point," said Neville quietly, and the room fell silent in surprise. Neville Longbottom rarely spoke in large groups, and never with the kind of authority that was creeping into his voice now. "My parents were tormented into insanity by Death Eaters when I was a baby. I've lived my whole life knowing what Voldemort's followers are capable of, and I've spent that time waiting for adults to keep me safe." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of students who had dismissed him for years. But the adults who were supposed to protect Harry let him be abused for 10 years while they watched and took notes. The adults who were supposed to keep us safe from Death Eaters have been keeping Death Eaters on staff. Maybe it's time we stopped waiting for protection and started providing it ourselves. Luna Lovegood, who had been sitting quietly in a corner, spoke up in her dreamy voice. "My father always says that truth is like a Nargles. You can't see them directly, but you can see the evidence of their presence. The adults have been hiding truth from us for so long that we've forgotten what it looks like when it's right in front of us." "Meaning what, exactly?" asked Padma Patil. "Meaning that maybe we've been looking for safety in the wrong places," Luna replied. "We keep expecting adults to tell us what's real and what's dangerous, but they've been lying to us about both. Maybe we need to learn to see truth for ourselves." Hermione was nodding enthusiastically. "Luna's right. We need to stop accepting information second-hand and start gathering it ourselves. We need to learn real defense, not just theory. We need to understand what threats we're actually facing, instead of being kept in the dark." "So what are you proposing?" asked Susan Bones, whose Aunt Amelia was leading the ministry investigation. "That we start our own resistance movement?" "Yes," Harry said simply, the word emerging before he had fully formed the thought. "That's exactly what I'm proposing. We form our own organization, with representatives from every house. We demand transparency from the staff about dangers to the school. We organize our own defense training, and we make our own decisions about our safety." The room erupted in excited whispers. Students who had never spoken to each other were suddenly debating strategy and organization. House divisions, which had seemed so important just a week ago, were dissolving in the face of shared vulnerability. "We'll need structure," Draco said, his strategic mind already working through logistics. "Leadership from each house, communication networks, ways to verify information independently. We can't just be a mob. We need to be organized. And we'll need adult allies," Hermione added, "not to make decisions for us, but to provide resources and access to information we can't get on our own." As if summoned by their conversation, the room's door opened to reveal Professor McGonagall. The acting headmistress stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the sight of 50 students from all 4 houses, meeting in secret to organize their own protection. "Mr. Potter," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Miss Granger. Mr. Malfoy. I believe we need to have a conversation." The students exchanged nervous glances, but Harry stood his ground. "Professor, we're not doing anything wrong. We're just trying to take responsibility for our own safety, since the adults have proven they can't be trusted to do it." McGonagall stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. "I'm not here to stop you, Mr. Potter. I'm here because I think you're right." The admission sent a shock through the room. Professor McGonagall, strict, rule-following, institutional loyalty personified, was agreeing with their student rebellion. The revelations of the past week have made it clear that traditional authority structures have failed you, she continued. As acting headmistress, I have a responsibility to ensure your safety and education. But as someone who has watched you grow up, I have a responsibility to treat you as individuals capable of making informed decisions about your own lives. She looked around the room at the assembled students. If you're serious about this organization, you'll need faculty support, not to control your decisions, but to provide resources, guidance when requested, and protection from those who might try to shut you down. You're offering to help us? Hermione asked, her voice reflecting her disbelief. I'm offering to treat you like the young adults you are rather than the children some would prefer you to remain, McGonagall replied. The choice is yours. Before anyone could respond, the room's door opened again, and Rita Skeeter stepped inside. Her appearance sent a ripple of tension through the group. After her recent articles, she was simultaneously the person they most feared and most needed. Ms. Skeeter, Harry said warily. How did you find us? The same way I find all my stories, Mr. Potter, she replied, but her tone was different from her usual predatory enthusiasm. By following the truth. And right now, the truth is that Hogwarts students are organizing to protect themselves from dangers that adults have hidden from them for too long. She pulled out her quick quotes quill, but instead of beginning to write immediately, she looked around the room at the assembled faces. I'd like to interview your leadership about this organization, not to create a scandal or to misrepresent your intentions, but to let the wizarding world know that young people are capable of taking responsibility for their own safety and demanding honesty from their protectors. Harry exchanged glances with Hermione and, surprisingly, Draco. The three of them had somehow become the de facto leadership of this movement, and the decision about how to handle Rita's request seemed to fall to them. What guarantees do we have that you'll report this honestly? Draco asked, his political instincts sharp as ever. The same guarantee I gave when I reported on Dumbledore's conversation with Professor Snape, Rita replied. My word that I will print exactly what you tell me, without embellishment or interpretation. Recent events have taught me that truth is more powerful than fiction. Luna stood up suddenly, her pale eyes fixed on Rita with unusual intensity. She's telling the truth. Her aura has changed. It used to be all sharp edges and hungry colors, but now it's more honest. Sad, but honest. The room looked at Luna with the mixture of confusion and acceptance that her pronouncements usually generated. Whether or not anyone believed in auras, they seemed to trust Luna's intuitive judgment about people. All right, Harry said finally. But we do this as equals. You ask questions, we answer them, and you report what we say. No leading questions, no dramatic interpretations, no sensationalism. Rita nodded, her quill poised over parchment. What do you call yourselves? Harry looked around the room at faces from every house, united by shared vulnerability and shared determination. We're students of Hogwarts, he said simply, and we're done being pawns in adult games. We're going to learn to protect ourselves, and we're going to demand the truth about the dangers we face. And if the adults refuse to provide that truth, Rita asked, then we'll find it ourselves, Hermione replied firmly. We'll research, we'll investigate, we'll share information across house lines and year boundaries. We'll become our own source of truth. As Rita's quill moved across the parchment, recording their words with the mechanical precision that had exposed Dumbledore's secrets, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced since this whole crisis began. Hope. Not hope that adults would save them, but hope that they could save themselves. The student uprising had begun, and with it, the possibility that truth and self-determination might prove more powerful than manipulation and control. Whether it would be enough to protect them from the dangers ahead remained to be seen, but at least they would face those dangers with their eyes open and their choices their own. Chapter 9. Revelations from the Past. The Ministry's conference room at Hogwarts had been transformed into something resembling a historical tribunal. Ancient texts, yellowed correspondence, and witness testimonies covered every available surface, while pensive memories swirled in silvery pools, waiting to reveal secrets that had been buried for decades. Harry sat beside Hermione, both of them struggling to process the magnitude of what they were learning. Across from them, Elphias Doge, a man so old his hand shook as he turned the pages of his testimony, spoke in a voice that carried the weight of nearly a century of friendship with Albus Dumbledore. "I've known Albus since we were 17, Doge was saying, his rheumy eyes distant with memory. I watched him transform from a brilliant, idealistic young man into something else. Someone who could calculate the value of lives like a banker calculating interest rates." Beside him, Bathilda Bagshot nodded slowly, her ancient face creased with sorrow. The change began with Grindelwald. Albus was so taken with Gellert's vision of magical superiority, so convinced that they could reshape the world for the greater good. Even after their falling out, the philosophy remained. Amelia Bones leaned forward from her position at the head of the table. "Can you be more specific about this philosophy?" Doge exchanged a meaningful look with Bagshot before responding. Albus came to believe that individuals could be sacrificed if their deaths served a larger purpose. That love, loyalty, and self-sacrifice were tools to be manipulated rather than virtues to be honored. "He started with small decisions," Bagshot added. "A student here, an Order member there. People who could be positioned to make heroic choices that would benefit the cause. But over the decades it became systematic." The conference room door opened, and a figure Harry had never expected to see walked in. Aberforth Dumbledore looked like a rougher, more weathered version of his famous brother, with the same blue eyes, but none of the gentle twinkle. His grey hair was unkempt, his robes practical rather than ornate, and his expression carried decades of accumulated bitterness. "Aberforth," Bones said carefully, "thank you for agreeing to testify." "I'm not doing this for you," Aberforth replied gruffly, settling into a chair across from Harry. "I'm doing it for the boy. Someone needs to tell him the truth about what his precious headmaster really is." Harry felt his stomach clench. What truth? Aberforth's gaze was direct and uncompromising. "The truth that my brother has been orchestrating deaths for the greater good since before you were born. The truth that your parents were just the most recent casualties in his grand design." "That's not," Harry started, but Aberforth cut him off. "I have letters, boy. Correspondence between Albus and various Order members, discussing which deaths would be acceptable losses, and which could be prevented without compromising the overall strategy." He reached into his robes and pulled out a thick bundle of parchment. "Would you like me to read them to you?" Hermione leaned forward, her analytical mind already working. "These letters, when were they written?" "Over the course of 2 decades, Aberforth replied. "Starting in the 1960s, when Albus first began developing his theories about necessary sacrifice, and continuing right up until your parents' deaths." He unfolded one of the letters, his voice taking on a formal reading tone. "This one is from 1979, addressed to Daedalus Diggle. While I understand your concern for the McKinnon family's safety, we must remember that their visibility makes them valuable as targets. Voldemort's attack on such a prominent light family would galvanize public opinion and strengthen our cause. Sometimes we must allow sacrifices to occur for the greater benefit." Harry felt the room spinning around him. The McKinnons, he remembered hearing about their deaths, remembered the way adults spoke of them as heroes who had died bravely for the cause. But according to this letter, their deaths had been calculated, anticipated, allowed. "Here's another," Aberforth continued relentlessly. 1980 to Mundungus Fletcher. The information you've provided about the Prewett brothers' planned mission must not be shared with other Order members. Their deaths will serve as a powerful reminder of what we're fighting against, and their martyrdom will inspire others to greater sacrifices." Hermione's face had gone pale. He let them die. He could have warned them, could have stopped them, and he chose not to. "But the worst," Aberforth said, his voice growing heavy with old pain, "is this one. From October 1981, just days before your parents were killed." He held up a letter that looked different from the others, written on finer parchment, sealed with Dumbledore's personal mark. Addressed to Severus Snape. The prophecy's fulfillment requires Potter's sacrifice, but it must appear to be Voldemort's choice rather than our manipulation. Lily's protection will ensure the boy survives, but only if James and Lily die, believing they are protecting their son rather than fulfilling our design. Their love must be genuine, untainted by knowledge of their true purpose. The silence that followed was absolute. Harry stared at the letter in Aberforth's hands. The words blurring as tears he hadn't realized he was crying made it impossible to focus. "My parents," he whispered. "They were deliberately. He knew they were going to die, and he let it happen." "He orchestrated it," Aberforth corrected grimly. The prophecy could have been interpreted many ways, applied to several different children. But Albus chose to focus Voldemort's attention on your family specifically, because he calculated that your parents' sacrifice would produce the exact magical protection he needed. Hermione was frantically taking notes, her academic mind trying to process the implications. But how? How did he manage to direct Voldemort's attention to the Potters specifically? Doge answered reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Through Tom Riddle. Albus had been guiding the boy since his Hogwarts years, shaping his understanding of magic, his obsession with death and immortality, his need to eliminate threats to his power." "You mean Dumbledore helped create Voldemort?" Harry asked, his voice cracking. "Not directly," Bagshot said sadly. "But he recognized Tom's potential for darkness and chose to nurture it rather than heal it. He convinced himself that a powerful dark wizard was necessary to unite the light side, to create a common enemy that would justify the sacrifices he had planned." Aberforth nodded grimly. "My brother has always believed that the ends justify the means. Tom Riddle was just another tool in his grand design, shaped and guided to fulfill the role Albus had envisioned for him." McGonagall, who had been silent throughout the testimony, finally spoke. "These allegations, they suggest that everything I've believed about Albus, everything I've supported." Her voice trailed off, the implications too vast to articulate. "Minerva," Doge said gently, "you're not responsible for Albus's choices. None of us are. We trusted him because he presented himself as wise and benevolent. We had no reason to suspect that his wisdom was actually manipulation and his benevolence was strategic calculation." Hermione looked up from her notes, her face reflecting a mixture of horror and fascination. "I've been researching patterns in historical records, looking at deaths during both wars against Voldemort, the number of heroic sacrifices that occurred precisely when they would do the most good for morale, the way information was shared or withheld to position people in dangerous situations." She shuddered. "It's not coincidence. It's systematic." "How many?" Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Dozens," Hermione replied quietly. "Maybe more. People who could have been saved if they'd received different information, different support, different timing. But their deaths served larger strategic purposes." Aberforth leaned back in his chair, his expression weary. "My brother convinced himself that he was saving the wizarding world, that the lives he sacrificed were necessary prices for the greater good. But the truth is simpler and more damning. He became addicted to playing God, to deciding who lived and who died based on his own moral calculations. Harry felt as though everything he had believed about his life, about his parents' sacrifice, about the nature of heroism itself, was crumbling around him. If this is all true, if everything has been manipulation and calculation, then what was real? What actually mattered? Your parents' love was real, McGonagall said firmly, reaching across the table to grasp his hand. Their willingness to die for you was genuine, even if Dumbledore exploited it for his own purposes. The protection they gave you, the sacrifice they made. That wasn't manipulation. That was pure love. But they might not have needed to die at all, Harry replied. If Dumbledore had made different choices, if he had directed Voldemort's attention elsewhere, if he had prioritized their safety over his strategic goals, then you might have grown up with parents, Aberforth said bluntly, and the wizarding world might have found another way to defeat Voldemort, one that didn't require the calculated sacrifice of an infant and his family. The weight of that possibility, of the life Harry might have had, the parents he might have known, settled over him like a physical burden. He had spent 14 years believing his parents were heroes who had died to save him. Now he had to confront the possibility that they had been pawns in a game he was only beginning to understand. "What happens now?" he asked finally. Bones gathered the letters and testimonies into a neat pile. "Now, we determine the full extent of Dumbledore's manipulations and ensure they never happen again. We create oversight, transparency, accountability. We make sure that no one person ever again has the power to decide who lives and dies for the greater good." As the ancient witnesses began to file out of the conference room, Harry remained seated, trying to process revelations that had fundamentally changed his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The past, it seemed, was even more complex and painful than the present. But perhaps, he thought, as he watched McGonagall gathering her own documents with shaking hands, understanding the truth, however devastating, was the first step toward ensuring that such calculated cruelty never happened again. Chapter 10. The Horcrux Revelation. The silence in the empty Great Hall was oppressive as Dumbledore finally faced the assembled group that would hear his ultimate confession. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table, flanked by those who had become his strongest allies over the past week, Sirius, Hermione, and surprisingly, Severus Snape. Around them, Order members, Ministry officials, and even Rita Skeeter waited for what they all sensed would be the most devastating revelation yet. Dumbledore looked older than his 113 years, his usual vibrant robes replaced with simple black, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a shallow stone basin on the table before him. The pensive silvery contents swirled with memories that Harry suspected would change everything once again. "There is one final truth," Dumbledore said, his voice barely carrying across the hall. "One last secret that explains everything you have learned about my methods, my choices, my apparent cruelty toward a child I claimed to protect." He withdrew his wand and touched it to his temple, drawing forth a silvery strand of memory. "The night Voldemort killed your parents, Harry, something unprecedented occurred. When the ending curse rebounded, it did more than simply fail to kill you. It tore Voldemort's soul apart, and a piece of it latched onto the only living thing in that room. You." Harry felt the world tilt around him. "What do you mean, a piece of his soul?" "You are what we call a Horcrux, Harry. An object containing a fragment of a wizard's soul, created through the act of violence. Usually this is done deliberately to achieve immortality. In your case, it was an accident, but no less real for being unintended." The words hit the assembly like physical blows. Sirius was on his feet instantly, his face white with fury. You mean to tell us that Harry has been carrying a piece of that monster's soul for 14 years and you never told anyone? I suspected from the beginning, Dumbledore replied quietly. The connection between Harry and Voldemort, the way he could sense the Dark Lord's emotions, speak Parseltongue, experience visions of Voldemort's actions, all of this pointed to a soul connection that should not exist. Snape's voice was deadly quiet. And the implication of this condition? Dumbledore's blue eyes, usually so bright with wisdom and warmth, were dimmed with what looked like genuine pain. For Voldemort to be truly destroyed, all pieces of his soul must be eliminated, including the piece that resides within Harry. The silence that followed was deafening. Harry stared at Dumbledore, trying to process what he was being told. He was going to die, not eventually, not if he made wrong choices, but inevitably, necessarily, as the final step in destroying Voldemort. This is why, Dumbledore continued, his voice growing stronger as he moved into explanation. Every decision I made regarding Harry's upbringing was designed to prepare him for this ultimate sacrifice. The isolation, the emotional abuse, the cultivation of his martyr complex. All of it was intended to ensure that when the time came, he would choose death willingly rather than fight to preserve a life he had been taught to devalue. Hermione's voice cracked as she spoke. The Dursleys weren't just failing to protect him. You specifically wanted them to make him feel worthless. A child who grows up beloved, cherished, confident in his own value, would fight desperately to preserve his life when faced with this choice, Dumbledore said. I could not risk Harry's self-preservation instincts interfering with what must be done. And my role? Snape asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. To reinforce Harry's sense of unworthiness, while simultaneously building his skills and courage, to make him strong enough to face Voldemort, but humble enough to embrace death when required. Your treatment of him was calculated to maintain his emotional vulnerability while developing his magical competence. Harry found his voice, surprised by how calm it sounded. So everything, my entire life, every relationship, every experience, was designed to make me willing to kill myself when the time came. Yes, Dumbledore said simply, though I prefer to think of it as preparing you to make the heroic choice to save others at the cost of your own life. The same thing, Harry replied, just with prettier words. Rita Skeeter, who had been sitting motionless throughout this revelation, finally spoke. Professor Dumbledore, are you stating for the record that you have spent 14 years psychologically conditioning a child to commit suicide for what you perceive as the greater good? Dumbledore's flinch at her blunt characterization was visible. I have prepared Harry to make a sacrifice that will save the wizarding world from a Dark Lord who cannot be defeated by any other means. That's not an answer to my question, Rita pressed. Have you or have you not deliberately damaged a child's psychological well-being to make him more willing to die? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Around the hall, Order members were staring at their leader, with expressions ranging from horror to disbelief to dawning understanding of their own complicity. Molly Weasley spoke into the silence, her voice shaking with rage. You turned us all into accomplices in profound mistreatment. You made us watch while Harry was systematically broken down, and you convinced us it was for his own protection. The protection was real, Dumbledore insisted. Every measure was designed to keep Harry alive until he was old enough and strong enough to fulfill his destiny. His destiny to die, Sirius said flatly. His destiny to be ended by the same monster who killed his parents, because you decided that was the most efficient solution to the Voldemort problem. Harry found himself standing, though he didn't remember deciding to do so. The conversation was swirling around him, but something inside him, something that felt surprisingly like peace, was settling into place. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice cutting through the arguments. Everyone turned to stare at him. "What doesn't matter, Harry?" Hermione asked gently. "The manipulation, the abuse, the calculated emotional damage. None of it matters because it didn't work the way he intended." Harry looked directly at Dumbledore, and for the first time since this whole crisis began, he felt no anger toward the old man, only pity. "You wanted to break me down, make me feel worthless, ensure I would choose death without a fight. But you made a crucial miscalculation. You gave me friends who valued my life even when I didn't. You put me in situations where I had to save other people, which taught me that my choices mattered. You tried to make me weak, but every challenge you threw at me made me stronger." He turned to address the room. "I do carry a piece of Voldemort's soul, and I will have to die to destroy it. But not because I've been conditioned to see myself as expendable. I'll make that choice because it's the right thing to do, and because I'm strong enough to make it freely." The stunned silence that greeted this statement spoke volumes. Dumbledore's carefully laid plans had indeed backfired. Instead of creating a broken child willing to die, he had forged someone capable of choosing sacrifice from a position of strength rather than despair. "Harry," Sirius said quietly, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Harry interrupted. "But not because Dumbledore wants me to, and not because I've been manipulated into it. I have to, because it's the only way to save everyone else, and because I'm the only one who can do it." He looked around the room at faces filled with anguish, love, and desperate hope. "The difference is that I'm choosing this, not being coerced into it. Dumbledore's manipulation failed because he underestimated the power of genuine friendship and love to heal psychological damage." Rita's quill had been moving steadily throughout this exchange, but now she paused, looking up at Harry with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Respect. "Mr. Potter," she said carefully, "this revelation, the Horcrux, your destined sacrifice, the systematic abuse, this is the story of the century, possibly the story of the millennium. The public has a right to know." Harry considered this, then shook his head. "Not yet. When Voldemort returns, and he will return, people will need to understand why I'm making the choice I'm making. But until then, this knowledge would only cause panic and despair." "You're asking me to sit on the biggest story of my career," Rita said, though her tone was more curious than accusatory. "I'm asking you to consider what kind of journalist you want to be. One who prints truth because it's sensational, or one who prints truth because it serves a greater purpose." Rita stared at him for a long moment, then slowly closed her notebook. "I think," she said quietly, "I've been the first kind for too long. Maybe it's time to try being the second." As the assembly began to disperse, people struggling to process revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about heroism and sacrifice, Harry remained seated at the Gryffindor table, the weight of his destiny pressed down on him. But it felt different now, not like a burden imposed by others, but like a choice he was making with full knowledge and acceptance. Dumbledore's plan had been to create a willing sacrifice through manipulation and abuse. Instead, he had inadvertently created someone strong enough to choose sacrifice through love and free will. The irony, Harry thought, would have been amusing if so many lives hadn't been damaged in the process. But perhaps some good could come from even the most flawed intentions, if people were willing to transform pain into strength and manipulation into choice. Whether it would be enough to save the wizarding world remained to be seen. but at least now everyone knew the true stakes of the battle ahead. Chapter 11. Choosing Sides. The emergency Patronus that blazed through the Great Hall's windows carried Kingsley Shacklebolt's urgent voice. Diagon Alley under attack. Dark mark over Gringotts. Voldemort has returned. The silver links dissolved into wisps of light, leaving behind a silence that lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before the hall erupted into controlled chaos. Students leaped to their feet, professors began shouting orders, and Harry Potter stood in the center of it all, feeling a strange calm settle over him like armor. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward arrived 9 months ahead of schedule because their revelations had forced Voldemort's hand. "Harry," Hermione said urgently, grabbing his arm, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently, "but not because Dumbledore planned it this way. Because it's the right thing to do, and because I choose it." Around them, the newly restructured Order of the Phoenix was mobilizing with an efficiency that would have been impossible under the old secretive model. McGonagall stood at the staff table, coordinating with Amelia Bones, while students from the unofficial council they had formed moved between the adults as equals, sharing information and suggesting strategies. "Neville," Harry called out, "take Luna and organize the younger students in the castle defenses. Draco, your mother's intelligence about Malfoy Manor's protections, we need those details now." The transformation was remarkable. Where once Harry had been excluded from planning, treated as a child to be protected rather than a participant to be consulted, now he stood at the center of a collaborative network built on transparency rather than manipulation. Snape approached the group, his black robes billowing with characteristic drama, but his expression was different, open, almost relieved. "Potter," he said formally, "I will continue my role as double agent, but only with your full knowledge and consent. No more secrets, no more manipulation disguised as protection." Harry studied the man who had tormented him for 4 years, while secretly working to keep him alive. "What do you need from me?" "Your trust, freely given rather than manipulated, and your word that when the time comes for your sacrifice, you will make that choice, knowing all the facts, rather than being coerced into it." "You have both," Harry replied simply. The words seemed to lift a weight from Snape's shoulders that he had carried for over a decade. Sirius and Narcissa entered the hall together, their unlikely alliance now formalized in the face of open war. Draco looked up from the tactical discussions he was having with Dean Thomas and Susan Bones, his face reflecting complicated emotions at seeing his mother working with the family's most notorious blood traitor. "The safe houses are prepared," Narcissa announced to the room. "Families with young children can be evacuated through the Flu network. Both Black and Malfoy properties are warded against detection. Working with my cousin has been enlightening," Sirius added with a slight smile. "Turns out family loyalty can transcend political differences when children's lives are at stake." Rita Skeeter moved through the organized chaos with her quill and parchment, but her role had transformed completely. Where once she would have been hunting for scandal and sensationalism, now she documented the proceedings with careful accuracy, creating a real-time record of how the wizarding world was choosing to face its darkest hour. "Professor McGonagall," she called out, "for the historical record, this collaborative approach to crisis management, with students included as full participants, this is unprecedented, isn't it?" McGonagall paused in her coordination efforts to look around the hall at teenagers working alongside adults as equals, their voices carrying the same weight in strategic discussions as their professors and parents. "Completely unprecedented," she agreed, "and long overdue. These young people have proven they're capable of extraordinary courage and wisdom when given the chance to exercise both." Luna Lovegood approached Harry with that dreamy expression that usually preceded her most insightful observations. "The truth has set everyone free, hasn't it?" she said quietly. "Not free from danger, but free to choose how to face it." She was right, Harry realized. For the first time in his life, everyone around him was operating from a place of complete honesty. No hidden agendas, no secret plans, no manipulation disguised as protection. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. A second Patronus arrived, this one from Tonks, stationed in Diagon Alley. "Death Eaters targeting Muggle-born families specifically. Need backup immediately. Voldemort not personally present, using chaos to test defenses." Dumbledore, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the hall, stepped forward. "I should lead the response." "No," Harry said firmly, and the conviction in his voice surprised even him. "You've proven that your leadership style puts people at risk. This needs to be collaborative, transparent, with everyone who fights doing so by choice rather than manipulation." The old man's face showed a flash of something that might have been hurt, but he nodded slowly. "You're right, Harry. Perhaps it's time for me to serve rather than lead." Amelia Bones took charge of the tactical response. 3 teams, 1 to Diagon Alley for immediate evacuation of civilians, 1 to coordinate with the Aura Force, 1 to establish communication networks and ensure information flows freely between all parties. "I'm going to Diagon Alley," Harry announced, and before anyone could protest, he continued. "Not because I have a death wish or because I'm being manipulated into heroism, because I'm the one Voldemort wants, and drawing his attention away from innocent families is the strategic thing to do." "Then you don't go alone," Ron said firmly, standing beside his best friend. "None of us go alone," Hermione added. "That's the difference between the old way and the new way. No more lone heroes carrying burdens in isolation." The final team that apparated to Diagon Alley 15 minutes later looked nothing like the secretive, hierarchical Order missions of the past. Harry stood alongside Auras and Order members, but also with students who had proven their courage and competence. Rita accompanied them, not as an outside observer, but as a war correspondent, documenting the truth of how the wizarding world chose to face evil. The scene that greeted them in Diagon Alley was chaos, shops burning, families fleeing, Death Eaters in their distinctive masks pursuing terrified civilians. But the response was unlike anything from the previous war. Instead of a small group of elite fighters working in secret, they had a coordinated network of defenders who trusted each other completely. Harry moved through the battle with a clarity he had never experienced before. Every spell he cast, every decision he made, came from a place of free choice rather than desperate reaction or manipulated heroism. When he faced the Death Eater who seemed to be leading the attack, his courage came not from a death wish carefully cultivated through abuse, but from genuine determination to protect people he cared about. The Death Eater pulled off his mask, revealing the face of someone Harry didn't recognize. "The Dark Lord sends his regards, Potter. He's curious to see how you fight when you know you're meant to die." "Tell him," Harry replied, deflecting a curse with a shield charm, "that I fight exactly the same way I always have, to protect people who matter to me. The only difference is that now I'm doing it by choice rather than manipulation." The battle lasted 3 hours, but when it ended, not a single civilian had been lost. Families had been evacuated efficiently, Death Eaters had been captured rather than simply driven off, and most importantly, everyone who had fought had done so with full knowledge of the stakes and their own agency in the outcome. As they regrouped in the leaky cauldron afterward, Rita interviewed participants with the kind of thorough, honest journalism she had never practiced before. "Miss Granger," she asked, "how does it feel to fight alongside adults, as an equal rather than being excluded for your own protection. Like being trusted with my own life for the first time, Hermione replied. Like being respected enough to make informed choices about risks I'm willing to take. And you, Mr. Malfoy, working alongside students from other houses, people your family would have considered blood traitors? Draco considered the question seriously. It feels like choosing loyalty based on character rather than politics, like deciding for myself what matters instead of inheriting my parents' prejudices. Harry found himself in conversation with Dumbledore as the crowd began to disperse. The old man looked genuinely humbled by the day's events. I spent so many years convinced that secrecy and manipulation were necessary tools for the greater good, Dumbledore said quietly. Today has shown me how much more effective truth and collaboration can be. The hardest part, Harry replied, isn't forgiving you for the manipulation. It's forgiving you for not trusting us to handle the truth. We were stronger than you thought we were. Indeed you were. All of you. Dumbledore's blue eyes held none of their usual twinkling calculation, only genuine regret and growing respect. Perhaps an old man can still learn new ways of serving the cause of good. As Harry walked back to Hogwarts beside his friends, surrounded by allies who had chosen to stand with him rather than being manipulated into it, he felt something he had never experienced before. Complete confidence in the path ahead. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because whatever came next, they would face it with honesty, courage, and the kind of strength that came from freely chosen solidarity rather than manipulated sacrifice. Voldemort had returned, but he would find a very different wizarding world waiting for him, one united by truth rather than divided by secrets, and led by people who chose heroism rather than having it imposed upon them. The final confrontation was still to come, but now it would be fought on their terms, with their choices, for their reasons, and that, Harry thought, made all the difference in the world. Chapter 12. Truth and Consequence. 3 months had transformed the wizarding world in ways that a century of secrecy never could have achieved. Harry Potter stood at the window of the newly established Transparency Council chambers, watching the morning crowds flow through Diagon Alley with a sense of purposeful energy that had been absent for too long. The street bore scars from February's attack, but they had been deliberately preserved as reminders, not of defeat, but of what happened when people chose to stand together rather than hide behind lies. "Minister Bones will see you now," announced Percy Weasley, who had traded his previous rigid adherence to corrupt authority for a flexible dedication to honest governance. His role as liaison between the new ministry and the various reform organizations suited him perfectly. Harry made his way through corridors that had been stripped of their previous pompous decorations and replaced with simple efficiency. The Ministry of Magic under Amelia Bones bore little resemblance to the bureaucratic maze that had enabled so much suffering through willful ignorance. "Harry!" Bones greeted him as he entered her office, which featured glass walls that literally embodied the principle of transparency. "I wanted to discuss the final preparations before you leave for Hogwarts." The conversation would have been impossible under the old system, a minister of magic openly discussing a teenager's plans to eventually sacrifice himself to save the wizarding world. But transparency had proven far more effective than secrecy at building genuine public support and understanding. "The new curriculum is working even better than we hoped," Harry reported, settling into a chair across from her desk. "Students are learning real defense, real history, real decision-making skills. When they graduate, they'll be citizens capable of thinking for themselves rather than followers waiting for someone else to make their choices." Bones nodded, consulting a file thick with reports from the reformed Hogwarts. "Professor McGonagall says enrollment is actually up despite or perhaps because of, the more challenging and honest educational approach. "People want truth," Harry said simply, "even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." The changes at Hogwarts had been dramatic, but welcome. The house system remained, but with the addition of inter-house councils that gave students real voice in school governance. The curriculum now included practical defense training, honest magical history that didn't gloss over uncomfortable truths, and critical thinking skills that encouraged students to question authority rather than blindly accept it. Most importantly, the student organization that had emerged during the crisis had been formalized as the Hogwarts Student Council, with representatives from every year and house working alongside faculty as genuine partners rather than token voices. "Speaking of truth," Bones continued, "Rita Skeeter's latest article about your training has generated significant public support. Her transformation from scandal monger to responsible journalist has been remarkable to watch." Harry smiled, thinking of Rita's recent pieces, careful, thorough investigations that informed rather than sensationalized, and always with the underlying message that transparency was the foundation of a healthy magical society. "She says honest journalism is more challenging but more rewarding than her old approach," Harry said. "Turns out the truth is usually more interesting than lies, once you learn how to tell it properly." The truth had indeed proven more compelling than fiction. Rita's ongoing documentation of the rebuilding process, the challenges of reform, and the personal stories of those affected by years of manipulation had helped maintain public support, even when progress was difficult. A soft knock at the office door announced the arrival of Severus Snape, whose role as openly acknowledged double agent had evolved into something like Minister of Magical Truth, a position that would have been unthinkable under the old regime, but seemed perfectly natural now. "Potter," he said with his usual formality, though the underlying hostility had been replaced by something approaching respect. "The intelligence from our sources suggests Voldemort is preparing for a major offensive. His frustration with the transparency movement appears to be driving him toward increasingly desperate measures." "Good," Harry replied, surprising both adults with his calm acceptance. "Desperate people make mistakes, and this time, when he shows himself, everyone will know exactly what we're facing and why." The conversation continued for another hour, covering logistics, timing, and contingencies. But unlike the secretive planning sessions of the past, this meeting included representatives from multiple organizations, student voices, and even international observers who had come to study the transparency model. Later that afternoon, Harry returned to Hogwarts for what had become his routine training session with the Order, except that these sessions were now open to anyone who wanted to participate, documented by Rita for public awareness, and conducted with full knowledge of their purpose. The Great Hall had been transformed into a training ground where Harry worked alongside Aurors, Order members, students, and even some reformed Death Eaters who had chosen rehabilitation over prison when given the option. Draco Malfoy, whose family's public renunciation of blood purity had surprised many, proved to be an exceptionally talented defensive instructor. His strategic mind, freed from the constraints of inherited prejudice, had developed innovative approaches to magical combat that were being adopted throughout the reformed magical community. "The difference," Draco explained to a group of younger students, "is that we're fighting for something we've chosen to believe in, rather than something we've been told to believe in. That makes us stronger because our motivation comes from within, rather than from fear." Nearby, Neville Longbottom led a group through advanced shield charm variations, his confidence having blossomed remarkably once adults began treating him as capable rather than fragile. Luna provided strategic consultation that, while unconventional, had proven surprisingly effective in practice. But perhaps the most striking change was in Albus Dumbledore himself. The former headmaster attended these sessions not as leader, but as participant, working to earn back trust through consistent action rather than manipulation. His famous intellect remained sharp, but he had learned to offer advice only when requested and to accept when his suggestions were rejected. "Harry," he approached during a break, "I wanted to thank you for allowing me to participate in today's session." "You don't need my permission to be here," Harry replied. "You just need to be here for the right reasons." "Indeed, and I believe I'm finally learning what those reasons are." The exchange was brief but significant. Where once Dumbledore had controlled through secrecy and manipulation, he was now contributing through transparency and service. The change was uncomfortable for him, but undeniably healthier for everyone around him. As evening approached, Harry found himself in the room of requirement with his closest friends and allies, not for a secret meeting, but for the regular strategy session that was open to anyone who wanted to attend. The room had configured itself as a comfortable conference space where teenagers sat as equals with adults, where former enemies worked alongside former friends, where truth was the only currency that mattered. "The latest intelligence suggests Voldemort will make his move within the month," reported Tonks, her hair a subdued brown that reflected the seriousness of the discussion. "He's becoming increasingly frustrated with his inability to infiltrate or corrupt the new systems we've built." "Because they're built on truth rather than power," Hermione observed. "He understands how to exploit secrecy and hierarchy, but transparency and collaboration are foreign to him." Harry nodded, feeling the familiar calm that settled over him whenever he contemplated his eventual confrontation with Voldemort. But this time, the calm came not from resignation or manipulation, but from genuine peace with a choice he was making freely. "When the time comes," he said to the assembled group, "I want everyone to understand exactly what's happening and why. No secrets, no hidden plans, no manipulation. If I'm going to die to destroy the piece of his soul inside me, I'm going to do it with the full knowledge and support of people who respect my choice rather than being manipulated into accepting it." The statement would have been impossible under the old system. Too honest, too direct, too devastating for people who hadn't been prepared for the truth. But this group had been built on honesty from the beginning, and they received his words with the gravity and acceptance they deserved. "We'll be there with you," Ron said simply. "Not to stop you or to manipulate you into it, but to support whatever choice you make when the time comes." "All of us," Hermione added, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Because that's what friends do. They stand together through the hard choices." As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Harry remained behind with those closest to him. Outside the windows, Hogwarts hummed with the activity of students and teachers working together in ways that had seemed impossible just months earlier. "You know," Luna said in her dreamy voice, "I used to see truth as something hidden behind veils that needed to be pulled away. But now I think truth is more like light. It doesn't hide. It just illuminates whatever it touches." She was right, Harry realized. The truth hadn't been hidden from them. It had simply been obscured by people who preferred darkness. Once they had chosen to seek light, everything had become clearer, stronger, more genuine. A week later, the expected attack came. Voldemort appeared in the heart of London, surrounded by his remaining Death Eaters, demanding that Harry Potter be surrendered to him. But instead of the terrified, divided magical community he expected to find, he faced a united front of people who understood exactly what they were fighting for, and why. Harry walked forward to meet him, not as a manipulated sacrifice or a reluctant hero, but as someone making a free choice supported by genuine love and understanding. Behind him stood friends, allies, and even former enemies, all united not by deception, but by shared commitment to truth and justice. The final battle would be fought on their terms, with their choices, for their reasons. And whatever the outcome, Harry knew that the wizarding world he was fighting to protect was already better, stronger, and more honest than the one that had raised him in secrecy and manipulation. As he faced the red eyes of the man who had shaped his life through violence and hatred, Harry Potter smiled, not because he was unafraid, but because he was finally, completely free to choose his own path forward. The truth had set them all free, and freedom, he had learned,